In all ages and for all peoples, water has always been the most important of the Earth's riches. Rome was no exception to this. The Romans took this idea to such a level that they insisted on their towns and cities having the most abundant and purest water possible. To achieve this, they covered the empire with audacious engineering projects designed to transport water from the richest natural springs to their towns. These projects were breathtaking in their proportions, unequaled in scale until our time. And despite having been built so many centuries ago, many of them are still standing today. The year 29 BC. The Emperor Augustus was the absolute ruler of the whole Roman world, and he took on the massive task of reorganizing the empire now under his control. As part of his strategy of territorial restructuring, Augustus decided to found the Colonia Nemausus, a great city in the province of Narbonensis. Nemausus was destined to be an important city, a city with an estimated population of 60,000 people. And so it was. Nemausus was a great city. The surviving remains we can see today in modern Nimes leave no doubt about that. A city of such a size, with such a large population, needed a plentiful supply of water. The Romans knew of a spring on the site where they wanted to build the city. It was a sacred spring to the Celts, and today it still fills the canals of this park. This is without doubt one of the oldest public parks in Europe. In addition to these springs, the Romans could count on abundant water from a large river just 5 kilometers to the north, the River Gard. For many peoples and civilizations, this would have been more than enough. But for the Romans, the flow from the springs was not sufficient, and the quality of the river water failed to meet their standards. They wanted a source with extraordinary water quality and an abundant flow. A source sufficient to provide for a large population that would no doubt grow continually over many years to come. The Romans searched for such a source, and they found it, here, in Uthes. The source of the Euro. A powerful spring that even today, 2,000 years after the Romans first used it, continues to provide an abundant flow of extraordinary high-quality water. The source of the Euro gives rise to a beautiful landscape that enchants all those who come across it. For many centuries, thousands of people have come every year to enjoy this extraordinary place. But the source of the Euro was 21 kilometers as the crow flies from the desired site of the city. And not only that, the terrain to the north of Nimes is very rugged. And between the city and the water source is the deep gorge of the River Gard, which would have to be crossed. How could they channel the water over such an enormous distance, overcoming the obstacles presented by the landscape? The Roman engineers knew how to do it. They would build a conduit. They would build an aqueduct. Thus, they put out a call for the best engineers. They needed to plan and build quickly. The city could not function without a guaranteed supply of such a vital resource. But before they did anything, they had to ensure that the desired location for the city was possible. All the engineers responsible for the city's construction waited impatiently for the confirmation that the location was valid. If it were not, they had to have an alternative proposal. Roman engineers were experts in gravity-defying water pumping and raising systems. However, in an aqueduct of such proportions, such systems were completely out of the question. The engineers knew that it would be much wiser to take advantage of the force of gravity rather than to try and overcome it. Therefore, the height of the city had to be much lower than that of the water source. A height that would be determined by the distance and the gradient chosen. With the advanced knowledge they had of building conduits, the Roman engineers knew that a gentle gradient only allowed for a meager flow of water and that the accumulation of sediments would eventually block up the aqueduct. On the other hand, too steep a gradient would cause an excessively aggressive flow that would erode and jeopardize the channel. There was a very narrow margin that would not lead to these problems. The minimum gradient was around 10 centimeters of descent per kilometer, and the maximum was no more than 50 centimeters. The aqueduct had to conform to these standards. That required admirable and extraordinarily difficult topographic precision. With these data, they quickly obtained the gradient and the distance. The city had to be built at an altitude of 54.8 meters above sea level. In other words, 4.2 meters lower than the level of the water source. But the distance as the crow flies and the total gradient were not taken into account. An aqueduct running in a straight line would have involved building dozens of kilometers of tunnels through mountains and arcades across valleys. This would have been unthinkable. To avoid this, they had to adapt the terrain and avoid the biggest obstacles. This considerably increased the length of the conduit, and they knew the longer it was, the lower they would have to build the arrival point. So, how were they to adapt the terrain? What route should they choose? The ideal route quickly becomes clear if we imagine a cut horizontal plane of the terrain from the level of the water sources to the area chosen for the city. The Romans were well aware of all this. This line of intersection with the terrain was the ideal and natural route. But there were unavoidable difficulties that had to be overcome, as well as desirable shortcuts that would help make the construction easier and cheaper. Sometimes they chose alternative routes. Sometimes they shortened it by digging tunnels or building arcades. While doing all this, they had to take into account the precise limits of the gradient to obtain the hugely important level at which the water had to reach its destination. The city had to be located below this level in order for the water to arrive, thanks to the effect of gravity. But how could the Romans calculate this over such a rugged territory of so many square kilometers? That was a magnificent achievement. How did they do it? We know it was essential for them to have an accurate map. With the help of dioptrics, they measured the horizontal angles of the mountain peaks, triangulation stations. The Roman topographers would have marked the mountain peaks and other relevant sites in the territory they wanted to survey. Dioptrics allowed them to pinpoint each of these sites and precisely measure the horizontal angles formed with respect to their position. They would have repeated this process from a multitude of different points to obtain a set of triangles for which they knew the angles. Then, using trigonometry, they calculated the distances. With this information, they could build up an accurate map of the territory. Today, this science is known as geodesy. But in this case, they were also going to build a conduit. So they also had to measure the vertical angles between the vertices of the triangles and between these and the valley bottoms. In this way, they were also able to calculate heights of all the points they were interested in. This information would have been included in the map of the territory. It was an extremely detailed map containing distances and altitudes. And with all these data, they calculated and decided on the exact route for the aqueduct, the terrain it would cross on each section, the best technical solution for each case, the effort needed to build it, the tunnels that had to be dug, the arcades that had to be built. In short, they could measure and evaluate the whole project. And thus, it was possible to obtain the information the engineers charged with building the city were anxiously waiting for, the suitable site to begin its construction. The water supply was assured, and Augustus could be informed that his new city was possible and well chosen. Rome would have approved the cost, provided the necessary funding, and appointed the people to manage the funds and oversee the work. The precision needed to lay out the route of an aqueduct, such as that of Nimes, still astonishes most modern engineers. However, defining the route was only the beginning. Building the conduits, raising the arcades and digging the tunnels demanded a great deal of knowledge, building skills and experience on the part of the Roman engineers. We are at the source of the Euro. The water was taken from here at the spring in an enclosed chamber and channeled through a conduit that was also completely enclosed. This conduit ran the whole length of the aqueduct until it reached its final destination. It had to be skillfully designed to be able to endure the flow of water and the passing of time. This required a refined and meticulous building technique. Along most of its route, the conduit was buried in the ground. In these circumstances, the building process was as follows. An open trench was dug. The bottom of this trench was then lined with large stones, covered by a layer of opus caementicum, the famous Roman concrete. Next, wooden shuttering was installed to help build the side walls, using small ashlars and mortar. To cover the conduit and protect it from the elements and light, a stone and mortar vault was constructed using curved shuttering. The conduit was waterproofed with a special mortar And finally, the whole structure was covered with earth. The final size of the conduit was perfect for carrying the desired amount of water. It was also large enough for a person to fit into. This was very important for maintenance work. Here in Uces, we have the remains of the sectioned conduit that shows us perfectly all the aspects of the construction method. Below the floor surface, although you can't see them, are the large stones. The walls are built of stone and mortar, like the vault. And here, the waterproofing mortar. Waterproofing of the aqueduct was very important, as leaks did not only cause a reduction in flow, but could also seriously damage the structure. This mortar was an excellent waterproofing agent made of lime and ground pottery, normally bricks or tiles. The mortar was called opus signinum, and we can see it perfectly here. The Roman engineers put a cordon of this material around the concrete joints. This is because the concrete joints suffer most from this problem, mainly due to expansion. This cordon, known as a toros, was the perfect solution to the problem. We can see how the final finish on the walls was a kind of red paint. The whole length of the Nimes aqueduct conduit was lined in this way. We are not sure of its purpose, but some theories say that it may have acted as a bactericide. A short distance from the water intake, we find something curious that interrupts the normal shape of the conduit. After a quick look, a modern technician would be able to see exactly what it was for. The water reached here from the source and came to a widening in the form of an inspection hatch and a bypass. The guide marks carved in the stone show us that there were sluice gates here. Straight away we can see that if we close this sluice gate and open the other, the water will be diverted, leaving the aqueduct dry. We can easily reconstruct how it worked. The sluice gates were not only used to divert all the water and leave the aqueduct dry, but also to regulate its flow by sluicing off any undesired amount. From here, the conduit continued to Nimes, facing the challenges of the terrain. There were many alternatives to the natural route of the conduit running across the ground. In the same way as it was sometimes advisable to take a longer route to avoid obstacles, it could also be useful to shorten it by digging a tunnel. To build the tunnels on the Nimes aqueduct, the Roman engineers first marked out the stretches. Then they redefined them. And finally, they sunk vertical inspection shafts at regular distances. When they reached the bottom of the shaft, they dug the tunnel in both directions, following the direction indicated with the help of plumb lines. These are the remains of one of the tunnels of the Nimes aqueduct. It would have been covered here, but the roof has been destroyed. Here we have the first inspection shaft. At this point, we can see how they built the tunnel out from the inspection shafts, using the bench excavation technique to tunnel through and extract the rock. Then they refined the result. The tunneling teams met between the two shafts. Here we see one of the tunnel faces, and here the other. This shows us that we are at a meeting point. This all had to be undertaken, paying careful attention to the level of the ground, which was key to the success of the conduit. The conditioning factor was the gradient, which had to be carefully controlled throughout the tunnel, with the entrance and exit levels linking perfectly. To achieve this, it was necessary to check the levels constantly and carefully, especially by using a water level. On occasions, the Roman engineers built arcades to take the aqueduct across valleys. The aim was to keep the conduit elevated and maintain the gradient while crossing the obstacle. These arcades were built of ashlars or other suitable building materials and were carefully designed to meet the particular challenges of each site. In these cases, for the conduit section, the Roman engineers opted for rectangular stonework, using large slabs instead of vaults to cover the conduit. In the rougher parts of the terrain crossed by the Nimes aqueduct, we can see some of the arcades that were needed to cross ravines. Here we have one of them. And thanks to the fact that the bridge is now damaged, we can see how this arcade was built of small stonework filled in with cement. As a curiosity, we can see that this bridge had already suffered serious problems in Roman times. On the facing, we can clearly see that it had been leaking and had had to be reinforced with this new exterior wall. Above the arcade, we can see the preserved remains of the channel. Above the arcade, we can see the preserved remains of the channel, with all the attributes we have learned about, except the roof, that has disappeared. We can see the walls perfectly. Here they are made of opus signinum, and there is something new, calcite deposits. This is caused by the calcium carbonate dissolved in the water, gradually building up along the walls of the channel. It is the same process that causes stalactites and stalagmites to grow in caves. This massive build-up of calcite deposits shows that the Nimes aqueduct was in use for many hundreds of years. It is amazing to look at these pictures, in which we can see that the Nimes aqueduct still refuses to die, despite having been abandoned nearly 2,000 years ago and having been subjected to the inexorable aggression of the elements since then. With everything we have seen, we can perhaps now understand the magnitude of this colossal project. The Nimes aqueduct is an impressive 52 kilometers long and has more than 2,600 meters of conduit built on arcades over valleys and ravines. To do this, they built at least 13 arcades of various sizes and types. And they dug more than 500 meters of tunnels, all with their corresponding inspection shafts. This was a massive project, and no doubt they finished it in just a few short years. Impressive. But we've forgotten one of the main difficulties involved in building the Nimes aqueduct: how to cross the deep ravine of the River Gard. The route must have been calculated to choose the best place. But it was still a huge challenge. They had to cross a distance of 360 meters at a height of 49 meters. As we will see later in this exciting documentary, the Romans had several ways of solving this problem. However, Nimes they adopted for the most audacious of all, and at the same time, the most beautiful. The Pont du Gard, one of the most impressive and beautiful arcades in the empire. It consists of some 11,000 stone blocks, most of them weighing 6 tons, and is as high as a 16-story building. 50,400 tons of stone. The Roman engineers planned and built an extraordinary structure that had to result the enormous and devastating stresses caused by the wind and the frequent flooding of the River Gard. They did it so well, and here we have it, 20 centuries later. Up here, some 50 meters above the River Gard, the views are impressive. We can see some of the hundreds of visitors that come here every day to see this marvel. We are in the conduit, which in some places has lost the slabs that covered it. Along it, we can see the building details we have learned about. The floor, with its imperceptible slope. The waterproofing. The calcite deposits. This is a good place to see the coat of red paint that covered the waterproofing mortar. And a few steps further ahead, on the lower edge, we can see the torus. It is interesting to note this alteration in the calcite deposits. All those preserved in the Nimes aqueduct have this mark. One hypothesis is that for a time there must have been a notable change in temperature, which left this mark on the deposits. Perhaps this is a mystery we'll never solve. Thus, the Nimes aqueduct, after 52 kilometers of crossing all kinds of obstacles and maintaining its subtle gradient, reached the required level. The place where it had to deliver water to the ancient city of Nimes. That level was here, in the Rue de la Lampais, in modern Nimes. We are 21 kilometers as the crow flies from the source of the Ural, but only 12 meters 30 centimeters below it. The city had to be built below this level. And this is where the water arrived and was distributed from. This was the Castellum Divisorium. The water entered here, with a flow of almost 36 million litres a day. Every litre of water that flowed from this outlet took 12 hours to cover the 52 kilometres separating it from the spring in Uces. As its name indicates, the Castellum Divisorium received the water and distributed it to the city through various conduits. Each was for a different use or for a different part of the city. Having guaranteed the supply for priority uses, the remaining water was emptied out through 3 vertical pipes that were in these 3 holes. This allowed a minimum flow of water to be maintained through the city's sewage system. By doing this, they managed to efficiently clean the drains, thus ensuring the city's health and avoiding bad smells, and above all, disease. The Nimes Aqueduct is one of many built in the Roman Empire to guarantee the vital water supply to their towns and cities. The huge area covered by the Roman Empire is full of marvelous examples. Each of them is a prodigious technical solution to an accumulation of challenges and problems. What we have seen and learned at the Nimes Aqueduct will now allow us to fully understand and enjoy the extraordinary examples we are about to see. We begin at Nimes, a small town in Celtiberia, in the middle of the Iberian Peninsula. Nimes is located at a very high altitude and has an extreme continental climate. Hot in summer and very cold in winter. It is poor in agricultural land and perhaps survived on stock breeding, although more probably on trade thanks to its strategic position as a crossroads and an important communications junction. Nimes was always an unexceptional town. The only public performance area we know of is an esplanade opposite this seating area. As you can see, it has been roughly hewn out of the rock and is only large enough to seat a few hundred people. Nimes was able to survive its indigenous past because some 4 kilometers to the southwest, as the crow flies, at the foot of the mountains, there is a spring with a good flow of excellent fresh water. The Roman engineers planned a conduit some 6 kilometers long that had to cross a tortuous terrain with continuous rock outcrops. Everything here is made of rock. It is either cut out of the rock or supported by it. And the aqueduct is no exception. A large part of the channel is cut directly in the rock. Its unusual shape tells us that it was covered by slabs, or more probably wooden planks. And the same is true of this distribution point. We can even see that this small sluice gate, which was used to divert the water or control the flow, is also made of rock. On the southern side of the town, a tunnel is preserved. This tunnel is almost 200 meters long. It has a feature that is not seen very often. We can observe that the inspection shafts have basins at the bottom to act as sand pits. These basins caught the solid sediments brought down with the flow of the water. This method of separating the solid particles from the water is known as decantation. Therefore, these pits are small decanters. Times was a small, unassuming town, but it had an important aqueduct in terms of its features and the effort it took to build. This demonstrates the importance placed by the Romans on providing their towns with a quality water supply. And Times was not an exception. The whole empire is strewn with ordinary towns with impressive aqueducts. Let's see another example. Only 250 kilometers from Times is the aqueduct that runs from Albarracín to Téllez. Téllez was a small Roman town. It was in the basin of the river Ebro. However, the spring they chose was in the basin of the river Turia. The 25 kilometers of aqueduct they decided to build meant bringing water from one river basin to another. It is one of the oldest water conduits between river basins in the history of humanity. The Albarracín aqueduct is one of the many forgotten or unknown wonders of the ancient world. The special characteristics of the territory it crosses meant it must have cost a fortune to build, as well as needing a huge amount of effort and ingenuity to bring it to fruition. At the beginning of the route, the rocky escarpments meant that they had to dig tunnels just a short distance from the rock walls. The line of windows shows us exactly where these galleries ran. The inconsistency of the rock made it unadvisable to build a channel on the escarpment surface. Faced with the difficulty of sinking shafts in these conditions, they made inspection points in the form of windows, an unusual feature in aqueducts. Journey through this territory, and you will soon become aware of the audacity of the Romans in thinking up this project. Planning such a complex route with tunnels in such a rugged, difficult-to-reach terrain was a display of huge bravado. To the difficulties of planning the route, we can add other serious building problems. Remember, these rocks have a very poor consistency. We can see how today this mesh has been installed to prevent rock falls. Some 18 kilometers to the east, the aqueduct suddenly turns towards the northeast. A large plateau stood between it and its destination. It was not possible to go round this plateau, as it forms the line of slopes that separate the rivers Turia and Ebro basins. There was only one solution: dig a tunnel through it. But this meant a 5-kilometer-long tunnel, to which we have to add the corresponding inspection shafts. An extremely difficult undertaking, involving a colossal amount of work. But that's how they did it. There, behind those hills, are the rocky escarpments we saw before. The conduit followed this valley, exactly over there, until it came to the plateau, right at this point. Here we have an inspection shaft. Remember that these shafts were used to carry out maintenance work, although while the water was flowing, they were covered. However, this one is not an inspection shaft, but a sluiceway. Sluiceways are devices to allow the runoff of excess water that could harm the aqueduct. Of the 5 kilometers of tunnel, only 120 meters are accessible today. The hollows we can see here are very common in all tunnels and galleries from ancient times. They were used by workers to light their way as the digging advanced, or to light the gallery itself. Here we find a point with something that was very common in ancient tunnel digging. They abandoned the tunneling here because the rock was too hard. They were probably looking for an area with a natural fracture in the rock to make it easier to dig. The tunnel continued over here. And here we can see a joint. The kind of natural fracture in the rock the diggers look for to make their tunneling work easier. And in this inspection shaft, we can see how the terrain above is much more insubstantial, meaning that it had to be widened as it got higher. The greater the depth of the inspection shafts, the wider their mouths had to be. And in the deepest of them, the mouths could be very large. This mouth, which is now blocked up, belongs to a 60-meter deep inspection shaft, large enough to fit a truck into. Just sinking this shaft was a huge undertaking. If the average distance between shafts was some 50 meters, they must have sunk around 100 of them. Many were up to 60 meters deep. This means some 35,000 cubic meters of rock was dug out by hand. An astonishing undertaking. The Albarracín Thea aqueduct is one of the great works of antiquity that has been practically forgotten today. It represents a truly incredible feat of construction that merits recognition and admiration. Now, let's look at the decision to undertake a project of this magnitude to provide water for a town of no greater significance, such as Thea, which moreover had a considerable emergence of water nearby. The source of the river Hiloca. This is overwhelming proof that the Romans spared no effort to ensure a constant supply of good quality water. So far, we've seen examples of towns and cities where the remains, the history and research have allowed us to trace the aqueducts back to the source of their waters, as well as to see how long they were and the exact routes that they followed. But this is not always the case. Sometimes we come across aqueducts that are true mysteries. About 100 kilometers to the southwest of Thea, we find the enigmatic Chelva Aqueduct. This aqueduct is named after the small Spanish town where we find the known part of its remains. It hasn't been given the name of the town it supplied because so far no one has been able to ascertain where that was. Despite being in a Mediterranean territory with a general shortage of water, Chelva is privileged in that respect. It has so many natural springs that there is even a tourist itinerary to visit them. It is more than likely that one or more of these springs would have been used by the Romans to feed the aqueduct. The height at which it is located makes this spring a good candidate. It is known as the Gypsy Spring. Hidden among the forests and mountains of Chelva, we can see important remains of arcades. Many of these arcades are in ruins, not because they haven't stood the test of time, but because their ashlars have been plundered over the centuries to be used for other buildings. These arcades, however, remain in excellent condition. They were built to cross this impressive gully. Once the aqueduct was no longer in use, the channels that once carried the water were destroyed, and for centuries were walked across by people and mules. This possible use and the inhospitable nature of the place, together with the difficulty of access, have saved this part of the aqueduct from stone robbers. Despite the excellent quality of the ashlars, it would have been too costly to transport them over such rugged terrain. However, these difficulties did nothing to dissuade the aqueduct builders from transporting the heavy stone blocks from a long distance away, as the type of rock from which they were cut is not the same as the rock from this area, which is of very poor quality for quarrying. A little further on from this ravine, they came to the mountain crest, where we can see the interesting solution they came up with to cross it. The Romans' first choice was a tunnel. However, the dangerous cracks in the rock forced them to cut away the whole crest, right to the top. The tunnel solution is only preserved in these few meters. We can see the large number of cracks and fractures and brittle nature of the rocks. Digging this tunnel must have given the Roman engineers more work than they had been expecting. These difficulties are evident on many sections of the aqueduct, where magnificent galleries cut through the craggy slopes. The reasons the Chelva Aqueduct was built, the springs that fed it, a large part of its route, and the town it supplied are all still a mystery today. We could speculate that its final destination was ancient Edessa, the modern-day town of Lydia, where the remains of large thermal baths have been found. But in reality, we still don't know. Nevertheless, a detailed study applying the rules we have learned about the design and leveling of aqueducts could answer some of these questions. We've reached the end of our journey. In this documentary, we've learned what an aqueduct is, the rules that govern its design, and the difficulties involved in building it. We've reflected on the need for accurate maps to plan the work, and therefore the need to have a good understanding of topography. We've seen the knowledge and the techniques needed to build and waterproof the conduits, dig the tunnels, build the arcades, and distribute the water. It has become clear that all this effort was to meet the demand for an abundant supply of quality water for the Roman towns and cities. We've seen how a huge technical and physical effort was dedicated to building highly complex aqueducts to provide water for towns that on the face of it were not that important. Now we can fully understand Pliny when he said, "It is the waters that make a city." No town or city was ever founded where the water from a good spring could not reach. By admiring these structures and appreciating the effort invested in them, we pay well-deserved homage to their Roman engineers and builders. It is yet another example of the human desire to excel and overcome the elements, and the human ability to strive and reach specific goals. The aqueducts of Nimes, Albarracín and Chelva are impressive works worthy of admiration. But in reality, they are modest examples compared to others in the Roman Empire. Even the great aqueduct of Nimes pales in comparison to the massive displays of prowess represented by the largest aqueducts of the Roman world. They are truly breathtaking and enthralling, and enough to fill many documentaries. We'll see some of them in the second part of Roman engineering, Aqueducts.